What would you do if saving a stranger's life meant risking everything you had fought to achieve? In 1843, deep in the untamed American wilderness, one man's split-second decision would shatter the boundaries between worlds and forge an unlikely bond that would echo through generations. Subscribe now for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the Arkansas wilderness like a shroud as Joe pressed his back against the rough bark of an ancient oak. His chest heaved with exhaustion, each breath a reminder of the 3 weeks he'd been running. The scars on his back, still tender from his last beating, pulled tight against his sweat-soaked shirt. Freedom. The word had become both his prayer and his curse. Joe Washington, a name he'd given himself the day he decided his life belonged to him alone, had been born into bondage on the Hartwell plantation in Mississippi. For 32 years he'd known nothing but the crack of the overseer's whip and the weight of cotton sacks that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. The plantation had been his entire world, a universe bounded by cotton fields that stretched to the horizon and the ever-present threat of punishment for the slightest transgression. Joe had watched friends sold away in the middle of the night, had seen strong men broken by the relentless brutality of the system, and had learned to keep his thoughts to himself while his spirit slowly withered. But everything changed the night he overheard Master Hartwell discussing his fate with the plantation's creditors. The conversation had taken place in the big house's study, but Joe had been repairing a loose shutter just outside the window when the men's voices carried through the thin glass. "That Buck Joe's getting too old for field work," Hartwell had said, his voice carrying the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock. "And he's been stirring up trouble with the others, teaching them to read, filling their heads with ideas about freedom. Best to sell him down to the sugar plantations in Louisiana before he becomes a real problem." Joe's blood had run cold. The sugar plantations were death sentences, brutal places where enslaved people rarely survived more than 7 years. He'd seen strong men return from those fields as broken shells, their spirits crushed along with their bodies. The work was backbreaking, the conditions inhumane, and the mortality rate so high that plantation owners calculated the cost of replacing workers into their profit margins. That very night, he'd made his choice. He'd gathered what little he could carry, a knife stolen from the kitchen, some cornbread wrapped in cloth, and a small Bible his mother had hidden away before her death. Most importantly, he'd taken the crude map that old Thomas, a runaway who'd been recaptured and returned years ago, had scratched into the dirt floor of the slave quarters before he died. The map showed a route through Indian territory, dangerous but beyond the reach of most bounty hunters. Now, 3 weeks later, he found himself deeper in Apache country than any runaway had dared venture. The bounty hunters had given up their pursuit 2 days ago, unwilling to risk Apache raids for the reward on his head. But Joe knew he couldn't stop, not yet. The territorial authorities had offered a substantial bounty for his return, and there were always men willing to risk danger for the promise of easy money. His stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion since his meager supplies had run out. The last of his stolen cornbread had been consumed yesterday, and the berries he'd found that morning barely took the edge off his appetite. Water was becoming scarce, too. The small creek he'd been following had dwindled to barely a trickle, forcing him to ration every precious drop. The landscape itself seemed to be testing his resolve. Thorny brush tore at his clothes and skin, leaving him covered in scratches that attracted flies and made sleep nearly impossible. The desert sun beat down mercilessly during the day, while the nights brought a bone-deep cold that left him shivering despite the small fires he dared to build in hidden ravines. As the sun climbed higher, Joe forced himself to move. Each step took him further from everything he'd ever known, but also closer to something he'd never dared imagine, a life where he answered to no master but himself. The thought sustained him through the pain and exhaustion, a beacon of hope that kept him moving when his body screamed for rest. The terrain grew rougher as he traveled north. Red sandstone cliffs rose like ancient sentinels, their weathered faces telling stories of countless centuries. The sparse vegetation spoke of a land that demanded respect from all who dared cross it, hardy plants that had learned to survive on little water and harsh conditions. This was Apache country, a fact that both terrified and comforted him. The Apache had no love for white men, but they also had no obligation to return runaway slaves to their masters. Joe had heard stories about the Apache from other slaves, tales of fierce warriors who could disappear into the landscape like ghosts and reappear without warning. Some stories painted them as savage killers, but others spoke of a proud people defending their homeland against invaders. Joe hoped the truth lay somewhere in between, and that they might see him as something other than an enemy. By midday, the sound reached his ears, a distant roar that grew louder with each step. Water. Not the gentle babbling of a creek, but the thunderous rush of a real river. Joe's pace quickened despite his exhaustion, his cracked lips already anticipating the relief of cool, clean water. Where there was water, there might be fish, or at least a chance to refill his makeshift water container and wash the grime from his body. He crested a small rise and stopped dead in his tracks. Below him, the Colorado River raged through a narrow canyon, its spring-fed waters swollen with snowmelt from distant mountains. The current was fierce, churning white foam against the red rocks that lined its banks like broken teeth. The sound was deafening, a primal roar that spoke of the raw power of nature unleashed, but it wasn't the river that made Joe's heart race. It was the group of people gathered on the far shore. Apache. Even from a distance, he could see their distinctive clothing and the way they moved with the fluid grace of people born to this harsh land. There were perhaps 20 of them, men, women, and children, their voices carrying across the water in a language that sounded like music mixed with the wind. They seemed to be engaged in some sort of ceremony or gathering, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Joe dropped to his belly, using the sparse brush to conceal himself. He'd heard stories about the Apache, fierce warriors who could track a man across solid rock and disappear into the landscape like ghosts. The smart thing would be to backtrack, find another route, avoid any contact that might lead to conflict. But as he watched, something went wrong on the far shore. A young woman, perhaps in her 20s, had been kneeling by the water's edge, filling what looked like a large pottery vessel. The bank beneath her feet, undermined by the spring floods, suddenly gave way without warning. She tumbled into the raging current with a splash that was immediately swallowed by the river's roar, the heavy water vessel dragging her down. The Apache on the shore erupted into frantic activity. Men dove toward the water's edge, but the current was too strong, the rocks too treacherous for anyone to enter safely. Joe watched in horror as the woman was swept downstream, her dark hair visible for brief moments before disappearing beneath the churning surface. Her people ran along the shore, trying to keep pace with the current, their shouts of alarm echoing off the canyon walls. She's going to die. The thought hit him like a physical blow. He could see it in the desperate movements of her people, in the way they ran along the shore, trying to keep pace with the current, but unable to help. The woman surfaced again, her arms flailing weakly, and Joe realized she was already exhausted from fighting the water. The heavy clothing that Apache women wore would be dragging her down, making it nearly impossible to stay afloat in such turbulent water. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden. These weren't his people. This wasn't his fight. He was a runaway slave with bounty hunters still searching for him, and getting involved would only bring attention he couldn't afford. If the Apache saw him, they might kill him on sight, or worse, turn him over to the authorities for the reward money. But as he watched the woman disappear beneath the surface again, another voice spoke in his mind, the voice of his mother, dead these 10 years. "Joe," she'd told him when he was just a boy, after he'd hesitated to help another slave child who was being beaten, "there's times when being human matters more than being safe. You remember that, son? The day you stop caring about other folks' suffering is the day you stop being the man I raised you to be." Before he could talk himself out of it, Joe was on his feet and running. The descent to the river was treacherous, a nightmare of loose rocks and thorny vegetation that seemed determined to stop him. Loose stones scattered beneath Joe's feet as he half ran, half slid down the steep embankment, each step threatening to send him tumbling into an uncontrolled fall. Thorny brush tore at his clothes and skin, leaving bloody scratches across his arms and face, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on the churning water below and the brief glimpses of the struggling woman. The Apache on the far shore had spotted him now. Their shouts carried across the water, a mixture of surprise and alarm that cut through even the river's roar. Whether they were warnings or threats, he couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. The woman had surfaced again, much further downstream, and her movements were growing weaker with each passing second. Joe could see that she was fighting not just the current, but exhaustion and the weight of her waterlogged clothing. Joe hit the water's edge at a dead run, not allowing himself time to think about what he was doing. The shock of the cold mountain water nearly drove the breath from his lungs. It was like being struck by 1,000 icy needles. The temperature so low, it made his muscles seize up momentarily. The current immediately seized him, trying to slam him against the rocks that jutted from the riverbed like broken teeth. He fought against it, using every ounce of strength he'd built during years of backbreaking labor in the cotton fields. Swimming had never been a luxury afforded to plantation slaves. But Joe had learned as a child in the muddy creeks and ponds near the slave quarters. This was different, wilder, more violent, more unforgiving, but the basic principles remained the same. Don't fight the current directly. Use it, guide it, work with the water instead of against it. He angled himself downstream, letting the river carry him while he fought to stay afloat and maintain some control over his direction. The woman was perhaps 50 yards ahead, her struggles growing more desperate and uncoordinated. She went under again, and for a terrifying moment, Joe thought he'd lost her completely. The current was so strong, the water so turbulent, that finding someone beneath the surface seemed impossible. Then he saw her hand break the surface, grasping desperately at nothing but air and foam. Joe took the deepest breath he could manage and dove. The underwater world was a chaos of bubbles and debris, a disorienting maelstrom that tumbled him like a leaf in a hurricane. The current spun him around, up and down, until he lost all sense of direction. His lungs burned as he fought to reach where he'd seen her last, his hands reaching out blindly in the murky water. Rocks and branches swept past him, any one of which could have knocked him unconscious or worse. Just when he thought he'd have to surface for air, his hand brushed against fabric, the distinctive weave of Apache clothing. He grabbed hold and pulled, feeling the weight of another person, dead weight that threatened to drag them both deeper. The woman was unconscious, her body limp in his arms, making her even harder to manage in the violent current. Joe kicked desperately for the surface, his vision starting to darken around the edges as his oxygen ran out. His legs pumped frantically, fighting against the downward pull of the current and the woman's waterlogged clothing. Just when he thought his lungs would burst, they broke through together. Joe gasped and choked as he tried to keep both their heads above water, river water burning his throat and lungs. The woman's face was pale, her lips blue with cold, but she was breathing, barely. Her breath came in shallow, irregular gasps that were almost lost in the sound of the rushing water. The current was still carrying them downstream, away from both groups of Apache. Joe spotted a fallen tree that had wedged itself between two boulders, creating a small eddy in the otherwise relentless flow. It was their only chance. With the last of his strength, he fought toward it. using a combination of swimming and allowing the current to push them in the right direction. His hands closed around the rough bark just as his muscles began to give out completely. For a moment, he simply held on, the woman's weight threatening to drag them both back into the current. The bark cut into his palms, but he held tight, knowing that letting go meant death for both of them. Then, inch by agonizing inch, he pulled them both toward the relative safety of the riverbank. Joe dragged the unconscious woman onto a narrow strip of sandy shore, his own body shaking with exhaustion and cold. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, and his lungs felt raw from the river water he'd swallowed. But the woman wasn't breathing properly. Her chest barely rose and fell, and her skin had taken on a greyish pallor that terrified him. No, he hadn't come this far, risked everything, just to watch her die on dry land. He'd seen the plantation doctor revive a drowning child once, years ago, pressing on the chest and breathing into the lungs. It had seemed like magic then, but Joe remembered the basic technique. He tilted the woman's head back, placed his hands on her chest, and began to push in steady rhythms, the way he'd seen the doctor do. "Come on," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the river water he'd swallowed. "Come on, breathe. Don't you die on me now." He bent down and breathed into her lungs, tasting river water and fear. The intimacy of the act struck him in his old life. Touching a woman this way, especially a woman of another race, would have meant death. But here, it was simply one human being trying to save another. More chest compressions, another breath. Joe fell into a rhythm, refusing to give up even as his own strength ebbed. He thought of his mother, of the lessons she'd taught him about the value of every human life. He thought of all the people who had died because no one had been willing to help them. Suddenly, the woman convulsed, river water pouring from her mouth as she coughed violently. Her eyes flew open, dark brown, wide with confusion and terror. She tried to sit up, but Joe gently pressed her back down, his hands shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Easy," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "You're safe now. You're safe." The woman stared at him, her gaze taking in his dark skin, his torn clothes, the scars visible on his arms. Joe could see the questions in her eyes, the confusion of waking up to find a stranger, a black stranger, hovering over her. But there was something else there too, recognition of what he had done. Gratitude that transcended language barriers. Before either of them could move, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears, hoofbeats pounding against the rocky ground like thunder. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, were riding hard along the riverbank. They'd found a crossing point upstream and were coming fast, their horses' hooves sending up clouds of dust. Joe could see the weapons in their hands, bows, lances, and at least one rifle that glinted in the sunlight. The woman followed his gaze and said something in her own language, a single word that sounded like a name, spoken with relief and love. One of the approaching riders raised his hand, and the group slowed to a walk as they approached, their weapons still ready but no longer aimed directly at Joe. Joe helped the woman sit up, then slowly raised his own hands to show he was unarmed. His heart hammered against his ribs as the Apache warriors surrounded them, their faces grim and unreadable. These were men who had seen battle, who had fought to defend their people and their land. Joe could see the wariness in their eyes, the careful assessment of a potential threat. The lead rider dismounted, a man perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his long black hair and scars that spoke of many battles. His clothing was more elaborate than the others, decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers that marked him as someone of importance. His eyes moved from Joe to the woman, and when she spoke to him in rapid Apache, his expression shifted from suspicion to something Joe couldn't quite read. The woman struggled to her feet, water still dripping from her clothes and hair. She was beautiful, Joe realized. not in the delicate way that white society prized, but with the strong, graceful beauty of someone who belonged to this harsh land. Her features were strong and intelligent, her bearing proud despite her bedraggled condition. She spoke again to the scarred warrior, gesturing toward Joe, and he caught what sounded like gratitude in her voice. The warrior studied Joe for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to weigh and measure everything about him. His scars, his obvious exhaustion, the way he held himself despite his fear. When he finally spoke, his English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "You saved Ayana." It wasn't a question, but Joe nodded anyway. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The simple question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Joe could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him, could sense that his answer would determine whether he lived or died in the next few minutes. These people had no reason to trust him, every reason to see him as a threat or an intruder. "Because she needed help," he said finally, meeting the warrior's gaze directly. "And because it was the right thing to do." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around them. He spoke to the other Apache in their own language, and several of them lowered their weapons slightly, though they remained alert and ready. "I am Nalnish," the warrior said, "war chief of this band. Ayana is my daughter." Joe's throat went dry. He'd saved the war chief's daughter. In the world he'd come from, such an act might earn him a beating for overstepping his place, for daring to touch a woman above his station. Here, he had no idea what it might mean. "What is your name?" Nalnish asked. "Joe. Joe Washington." "You are not from here? Your skin?" Nalnish paused, choosing his words carefully. "You are like the dark-skinned people the white men keep as slaves." There was no point in lying. These people would see through deception immediately, and honesty was his only hope for survival. "I was a slave. I ran away." A murmur went through the Apache warriors, voices speaking in their own language. Some sounded surprised, others thoughtful. Nalnish raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Joe's face. "You risk much to save one who is not your people." "She's a person," Joe said simply. "That makes her my people." For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered in Nalnish's eyes. He turned to his daughter, and they spoke in rapid Apache for several minutes. Joe caught the word Washington several times, and what sounded like heated debate among the other warriors. Some voices sounded supportive, others skeptical or concerned. Finally, Nalnish turned back to Joe, his expression grave but not hostile. "You will come with us," he said. "The council will decide your fate." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't spoken with cruelty either. Joe nodded, understanding that he had no choice in the matter. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. The Apache village nestled in a hidden canyon, like a secret whispered by the wind itself. Adobe and brush structures blended seamlessly with the red rock walls, making the settlement nearly invisible until you were upon it. Joe rode behind one of the warriors, his hands unbound but his future uncertain, taking in every detail of this place that might become either his sanctuary or his grave. The village was larger than he'd expected, with perhaps 60 or 70 dwellings arranged in a careful pattern that followed the natural contours of the canyon. Gardens flourished in protected alcoves, their green growth a stark contrast to the red rocks surrounding them. Children played in the dusty pathways between homes, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls, while women worked at various tasks, weaving, preparing food, tending to the gardens that provided sustenance in this harsh land. Ayana had recovered enough to ride her own horse, though Joe noticed she stayed close to her father throughout the journey. She'd spoken little since the rescue, but her eyes often found his, carrying a weight of gratitude that needed no translation. When their gazes met, she would nod slightly, a gesture that seemed to say she understood the risk he had taken for her. As they entered the village, curious faces emerged from doorways and gathered around cooking fires. Children pointed and whispered, their mothers pulling them closer with protective instincts that Joe understood completely. He had expected fear or hostility, but what he saw was something more complex, curiosity mixed with caution, and in some faces, what looked almost like recognition. An elderly woman approached the group. Her weathered face creased with concern as she spoke rapidly to lawless in Apache. Her eyes kept moving to Joe, not with fear, but with what seemed like understanding. She gestured toward Ayana, clearly asking about her condition, then said something that made several of the warriors nod in agreement. "They have heard of your people," lawless explained, noticing Joe's confusion. "Some who escaped the white man's chains have passed through our lands before. Not many, but some. We know what it means to flee from those who would enslave you." The comparison struck Joe powerfully. He'd never thought of the Apache as people who might understand his situation. But of course they did. They too were fighting for their freedom, their right to live according to their own customs and beliefs. They too faced an enemy that saw them as less than human, that sought to control or destroy their way of life. They stopped before a large structure at the village's heart, a council lodge built into a natural alcove in the canyon wall. The building was impressive, constructed with a combination of stone, adobe, and timber that spoke of both permanence and harmony with the natural environment. Symbols were carved into the wooden posts that supported the roof, telling stories Joe couldn't read but somehow felt the importance of. lawless dismounted and gestured for Joe to do the same. "You will wait here while the council gathers," he said. "Do not try to leave. There is nowhere to run in this canyon, and my warriors know every path, but also understand you are not a prisoner unless the council decides you are a threat." Joe nodded, understanding the warning beneath the words. He was a guest here, but also someone whose fate hung in the balance until the Apache decided otherwise. An elderly woman approached carrying a bowl of water and clean clothes. She was perhaps 60 years old, her grey hair braided with silver ornaments, her face kind but cautious. She spoke no English, but her gestures were clear. Joe gratefully accepted the opportunity to wash the river mud from his skin and change into the simple cotton shirt and leather pants she provided. The clothes were well made, comfortable, and clean, luxuries he hadn't experienced in weeks. His own clothes, torn and filthy from weeks of flight, were taken away, though he noticed the woman handled them with care rather than disgust. It was a small gesture, but it suggested a level of respect he hadn't expected. As he cleaned himself, Joe became aware of the village's rhythms around him. People went about their daily tasks with the efficient grace of a community that had learned to work together for survival. He saw men working on weapons and tools, women preparing food and tending children, elders sitting in the shade sharing stories and wisdom. It was a functioning society, complete and self-sufficient in ways that impressed him. As the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, drums started beating, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The rhythm was complex, layered, speaking of traditions that stretched back countless generations. People began gathering around the council lodge, their faces serious in the firelight that now flickered from several sources throughout the village. Joe watched the preparations with growing nervousness. He'd heard stories about Indian councils, most of them probably exaggerated or completely false, but he couldn't shake his anxiety about what was to come. His life hung in the balance, and he had no idea what these people valued, what they might see as virtues or crimes. lawless reappeared, now dressed in ceremonial clothing, decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers that caught the firelight. The transformation was striking. He looked every inch the war chief, a man of authority and power. "The council is ready," he said. "You will speak truthfully. Our elders can sense lies like wolves sense fear." The interior of the council lodge was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a central fire pit that cast dancing shadows on the walls. 7 elders sat in a semicircle, their faces weathered by decades under the desert sun. Joe recognized the weight of accumulated wisdom in their eyes, the same look he'd seen in the oldest slaves on the plantation, people who had survived by understanding the world's harsh truths. The walls were decorated with symbols and paintings that told stories Joe couldn't interpret but felt the power of. These were the chronicles of a people, their history and beliefs made visible in pigment and design. The air was thick with the smoke of burning sage, a scent that seemed to clear his mind and calm his nerves. Ayana sat to one side, now dressed in traditional Apache clothing that emphasized her natural grace. She'd braided her long hair with silver ornaments that caught the firelight, and Joe was struck again by her beauty and strength. When their eyes met, she offered him a small smile of encouragement. Nilnish gestured for Joe to sit in the center of the semicircle. The eldest of the council members, a woman whose hair was white as winter snow, spoke first. Her voice was strong despite her age, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Nilnish translated her words. She asks why you risked your life for one of our people when you owe us nothing. Joe considered his words carefully. These people valued honesty, but they also needed to understand his motivations in terms they could respect. He thought of his mother's teachings, of the lessons learned through years of suffering and observation. "Where I come from," he began, "I was treated as property, not as a human being. I was bought and sold like livestock, beaten when I didn't work fast enough, and told I had no value beyond my labor." He paused, meeting each elder's gaze in turn. "But my mother taught me that every person has worth, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. When I saw your daughter in danger, I didn't see an Apache woman or a stranger. I saw a human being who needed help," Nalnish translated, and Joe watched the elders' faces for any reaction. The white-haired woman nodded slowly, then spoke again, her words carrying a different tone. "She says you speak of your mother with respect. Where is she now?" "Dead," Joe said simply, the word carrying years of grief. "She died when I was 22, worked herself to death in the cotton fields, picking from dawn to dusk until her body just gave out." Another elder, a man with ritual scars covering his cheeks, leaned forward and spoke. Nalnish's translation carried a harder edge, a challenge that made Joe's pulse quicken. "He asks if you seek revenge against the white men who enslaved you." This was dangerous ground. Joe could feel the tension in the lodge increase. The Apache had their own bitter history with white settlers and soldiers, their own reasons for anger and hatred. The wrong answer here could mark him as either a coward or a threat. "I seek freedom," Joe said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "Not revenge. Revenge would make me like them. Someone who believes he has the right to control or harm others. I want to live my life as a free man, to work for myself, to make my own choices. If I can do that without harming anyone, that's all I want." The scarred elder's expression softened slightly at this answer, and Joe sensed he had passed some kind of test. A third elder, younger than the others but still grey-haired, spoke at length. Nalnish listened intently before translating. "He says that 3 summers ago, Apache warriors found a group of escaped slaves dying of thirst in the desert. They gave them water and directions to Mexico, where they could be truly free. 2 of those people later returned with gifts for the tribe, blankets and tools they had made with their own hands as free people." Nalnish paused, his eyes studying Joe's face. "He asks if you would do the same. Remember those who helped you when you had nothing." "Yes," Joe said without hesitation. "I would. A debt of kindness should always be repaid." The questioning continued for over an hour. They asked about his skills, his plans, his understanding of Apache customs. Joe answered as honestly as he could, admitting when he didn't know something rather than trying to guess. He spoke of his ability to read and write, skills that were rare among escaped slaves and might prove valuable. He talked about his knowledge of farming and animal husbandry, his experience with tools and construction. When they asked about his intentions, Joe was careful to express respect for their ways while making it clear he had no desire to impose his own beliefs on anyone. He wanted only the chance to live freely, to contribute to whatever community would accept him, and to prove himself through his actions rather than his words. Finally, the white-haired elder raised her hand for silence. She spoke for several minutes, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. When she finished, the other elders nodded in agreement, their faces grave but not hostile. Nalnish stood and faced Joe, his expression unreadable. "The council has decided. You saved the life of one of our people at great risk to yourself. This creates a debt that must be honored." He paused, and Joe held his breath. "You will be given sanctuary in our village for as long as you need it. You will work alongside our people, contribute to the welfare of the tribe, and learn our ways. In return, you will have our protection." Relief flooded through Joe like cool water, but Nalnish wasn't finished. "However," the war chief continued, "this protection extends beyond just you. The council recognizes that a man who would risk his life for a stranger is a man of honor. Should you ever have children, they too will be welcome among us. They will be raised as Apache if they choose, with all the rights and responsibilities that brings." Joe's eyes widened. In the world he'd fled, his children would have been born into slavery, their lives predetermined by the color of their skin. Here, they were being offered something he'd never dared dream of, true acceptance, a place to belong. He began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. "You don't know what to say." The white-haired elder spoke again, and this time Ayana translated, her English careful but clear. "She says that actions speak louder than words. You have already shown who you are. Now you must show who you will become." As the council dispersed, Nalnish approached Joe. "You will stay in my lodge tonight. Tomorrow, we will find you a place of your own and work that suits your skills. But first, there is someone who wishes to speak with you." Ayana stepped forward, her dark eyes meeting Joe's. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Thank you," she said in English, then continued in Apache. Nalnish smiled as he translated. "She says that you gave her back her life, and now she wants to help you build a new one. She offers to teach you our language and our ways so that you might truly become one of us." Joe looked at this remarkable woman who had nearly died in his arms just hours ago, and who was now offering to help him find his place in her world. For the first time since he'd fled the plantation, he felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. "I would be honored," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. 6 months later. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson as Joe, now known to the Apache as Bilagan Ayaji, Little White Man, a name given with affection rather than mockery, worked alongside Nalnish to repair a section of the village's water channel. The intricate system of channels and reservoirs that brought water from the river to the village was a marvel of engineering, designed to work with the natural flow of the land rather than against it. His hands, once soft from months of flight and recovery, had grown calloused again. But these were different calluses, earned through work that benefited himself and his chosen community rather than enriching a master who saw him as property. The work was satisfying in a way that plantation labor had never been, because every improvement he made to the village improved his own life as well. "You learn quickly," Nalnish observed. watching Joe fit a stone into place with the skill of someone who understood both the work and its importance. Ayana says your Apache improves every day. Joe smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. His conversations with Ayana had indeed progressed far beyond basic vocabulary. They could now discuss complex ideas, share stories, and even engage in the gentle teasing that marked true friendship. She was a patient teacher, but more than that, she had become something he'd never been allowed to have with a woman in his previous life, a true companion. "She's a good teacher," he replied in Apache, still careful with the tonal inflections that could change a word's meaning entirely. The language was musical, complex, and beautiful in ways that English couldn't match. "She is more than that," Nalnish said, switching to English. "She is a woman of great wisdom and strength. The young men of the tribe have noticed." Joe felt an unexpected pang at these words, though he couldn't quite name the emotion. In the months since his rescue, he'd grown to deeply respect Ayana, and if he was honest with himself, his feelings had begun to evolve beyond simple gratitude. She was intelligent, kind, strong, and beautiful, but more than that, she saw him as a complete person rather than a former slave or an outsider. "She deserves someone worthy of her," he said carefully, not wanting to reveal too much of his own feelings. Nalnish studied him with the penetrating gaze that had first evaluated Joe by the river. "Worth is not determined by birth or blood," he said finally. "It is determined by actions, by character, by how a man treats others when he has nothing to gain from kindness." Before Joe could respond, shouts erupted from the village's entrance. Both men dropped their tools and ran toward the commotion. Joe's heart racing with the fear that bounty hunters had somehow found him. The village had become his sanctuary, and the thought of bringing danger to these people who had accepted him filled him with dread. Instead, they found a group of Apache warriors surrounding 3 strangers, 2 men and a woman, all clearly exhausted and desperate. Their dark skin and ragged clothes told a story Joe knew all too well. They were thin to the point of starvation, their clothes hanging in tatters, their eyes holding the haunted look of people who had seen too much suffering. "Runaway slaves," Nalnish said grimly. "They must have been traveling for weeks." Joe approached the group slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. The 3 fugitives watched him warily until he spoke, his voice gentle and reassuring. "You're safe here," he said in English. "These people helped me too." The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. The woman, perhaps 30 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward. Her voice shook with exhaustion and hope. "You're like us?" she asked, hope and disbelief warring in her voice. "I was," Joe said. "I escaped from a plantation in Mississippi 6 months ago. The Apache gave me sanctuary." "Mississippi?" one of the men said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We came from Alabama. Been running for near 2 months now. Lost everything, but we kept going because we heard there might be help out here." The other man, younger but bearing scars that spoke of brutal treatment, looked around at the Apache warriors with a mixture of fear and hope. "They really help folks like us?" "They do," Joe assured him. "But you need to understand, this isn't charity. They'll expect you to contribute, to learn their ways, to become part of their community. It's not easy, but it's freedom." Joe turned to Nalnish, switching to Apache. "They're like I was, escaped slaves seeking freedom. They need help." Nalnish nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "The council will need to meet, but I believe they will be welcomed as you were. We have learned that those who flee slavery often become valuable members of our community. They understand the value of freedom because they have lived without it." As the 3 newcomers were led away to be fed and cared for, Joe felt a profound shift in his understanding of his place in this world. He wasn't just a refugee who had found sanctuary. He was part of something larger, a community that offered hope to those who had none. The village had become a beacon for people seeking freedom, a place where the color of your skin mattered less than the content of your character. That evening, as the village settled into its nightly rhythms, Joe found himself walking with Ayanna along the canyon's edge. The stars were brilliant in the clear desert sky, unmarred by the smoke and lights of civilization. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scents of sage and juniper that had become the perfume of his new life. "You were happy today," she observed, her English now fluent after months of practice. "When the new people arrived." "I was," Joe admitted. "It reminded me that what happened to me, finding acceptance here, wasn't just luck. It's who your people are." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then said, "My father told me what you said about worth not being determined by birth. Do you truly believe that?" Joe stopped walking and turned to face her. In the starlight, her face was luminous, her dark